Where and when were you born?
Was born in Las Vegas, of all places, in 1945.
And I know Gina, your wife, is an astrologer, so you must know something about your astrological type, which is?
Aries.
Uh-huh. And do you identify with being an Aries?
Well, Gina tells me that I'm a classic Aries.
How so?
Well, I think you really should ask Gina about that rather than me. I'm not an expert on astrology, but it has to do with how reactive I am and how combative I am. I apparently also have the facial type of an Aries, but I'll take her word for that.
Oh, what's her astrological sun sign?
I'm not sure she wants that discussed.
Okay.
You'll have to ask her.
Okay. I'm also asking people about their birth order, because one of the people that I interviewed told me about a book called Rebel Scientists, where the author says that rebel scientists tend to be later born. That's not true of my study, but let's see how you fit in.
I'm the eldest child.
Of how many?
3.
Yeah, that's pretty typical. And have you had a chance to take the Myers-Briggs, Keirsey and Bates?
Never did.
Well, I sent you the link, I think. I'll send it again, so I hope you can take it.
Well, I've resisted for 74 years. Let's see if you can get me to do it.
Well, it's for science, because there's very definitive, there's 4 different Jungian typologies, and everybody but 2 people are intuitive rather than sensing. So it's good data, because it's so improbable that so many people would test out so lopsided. Okay. You've studied in London. You've worked on the East Coast, kind of West Coast. Do you teach differently when you're in London, or what do you find in terms of like a national character? How are you shaped by being born in the West?
Well, I lived in Las Vegas when I was born there less than a year. We moved to Ohio after the war ended. And so 66 years later that I retired and returned to the scene of the crime.
And why Las Vegas? I mean, it's hot and deserty.
Well, apart from the cosmic completeness of going back to where I started, it's a great place to retire. No state income tax, good property values, and sunny 330 days out of the year. So life is a constant struggle against the relentless optimism produced by all that sunshine.
For me, going to Las Vegas, it all is worth it to go watch the fountains at Bellagio and hear the Italian music, and then eat brunch there in their great buffet. That alone would bring me to Las Vegas.
It's a perk, no doubt about it.
But, okay, so when you studied in London, did you find that there were different kind of modes of thinking or way you would approach people as a teacher?
Well, I wasn't teaching there. I was still an undergraduate when I was in London. So I didn't really have a perspective on that particular issue. I found the English philosophers were a bit different from the American philosophers that I had been acquainted with at the time.
How so?
They were more interested in scoring points and being clever than really getting at the truth.
Interesting. All right. So what was there about your childhood, your family, that led you to be a scientist, a philosopher?
Yeah, well, I'm not a scientist.
You do the philosophy of science, let's say.
Right. Nothing in my family helped with that. I discovered philosophy as I was an undergraduate, and I had to make a choice between a career in philosophy and a career in music. And I figured one was clearly more stable than the other. And if I went into philosophy, I might have a job I couldn't get fired from quite so easily as being a musician. And it wouldn't prevent me from being a musician, and that's how it worked out.
You're a jazz pianist, correct?
Yes.
And
yes.
composer. And
yes.
Do you still compose and play?
Not as much as I used to, and I'm having some physical issues at this stage in my life, so I'm not playing as much as I used to.
What about your family's religious training? How did they teach? What did they teach you about spirituality and religion?
I didn't even know the word spirituality at that time. My mother was a very assimilated Jew. My father was converting from being an Orthodox Jew to try to live with my mother. And he wanted me to go through all the usual paces, get a typical bar mitzvah and all that. But he never really conveyed to me any reason for why I should be interested in Judaism.
And so did you go to Saturday school or whatever it's called for kids?
Yes, I went to religious school. I went through the usual training for bar mitzvah and then completely forgot about it.
And then I'm assuming that you developed an interest in spirituality. Is that correct?
I always have trouble with that question because I don't know what is meant by spirituality. I think it's a very amorphous concept.
Different than everything is simply material, and when you die, and there's nothing but material.
My family had nothing to do with that. In my early days as a philosophy student and professional philosopher, I still adhered to a kind of glib materialist philosophy. I thought that was the thing to do if I was to be appropriately tough-minded. And it was a particular experience that shook me out of my complacency.
What was that?
It was a slow day in Northampton, Massachusetts, and a couple friends came over. We'd seen the only movie in town, looking for something to do, and they said, well, let's play this game called Table Up. What they meant was, let's have a seance. And they had played this game Table Up a few times before, and they said, when it works, it's a lot of fun. So for the next 3 hours in broad daylight with my own table, I watched my table tilt up and down in the air with our fingers just lightly touching the top. Standing next to the table, it was rising under our fingers. Legs were not pushing the table up. It spelled out answers in response to questions. It didn't convert me to anything in particular right at that time, and I knew I couldn't really discuss it with my mentors. So I literally put it out of mind until I finished my Ph.D., got a job in philosophy, did some, I hope, respectable work in philosophy of time and philosophy of language, and got tenure. And then with the security allegedly afforded by tenure, I remember this incident that happened back in grad school, and I figured if I was a responsible philosopher and intellect, I needed to look seriously into this. I knew at that time that some major philosophers had studied the evidence from parapsychology and taken it seriously. So I read what they had to say, and I decided there was something worth sinking my teeth into. And that's how it started.
Did you use a Ouija board on the table to spell out, or how did you get answers?
My friends didn't really know anything about parapsychology either. They didn't know that in the old heyday of spiritualism or spiritism, the usual way of getting messages through table tilting was to ask yes or no questions and have the table tilt, say, once for yes, twice for no, or twice for yes, three for no, something like that. So what my friends did was have the table nod once for the letter A, twice for the letter B, 3 times for the letter C.
Oh boy.
That's why we did this for 3 hours,
Yeah.
forever to get a message.
But there were kind of coherent answers that came to you from this spelling it out.
We allegedly contacted 3 entities. One claimed to be John Wayne, who had recently died. Another claimed to be the mythical river Styx, so I don't think that was a legitimate communication. And the third one claimed to be from someone whose name spelled out Horace T. Jecum, Jecum. Figured, well, that was something. All I needed to do was to go down to City Hall and find out if there was a Horace Jecum who built a spooky 18th century house that I was living in. But it turned out the house was so old it antedated city records, so I never did find out. Still, we got this interesting communication that spelled out a name, but I had no idea. The whole thing scared the hell out of me, and I had no idea at the time who was causing the table to rise. I was sure my friends were not playing a practical joke. That was not their style. It was broad daylight. I could see easily what was happening. And so I didn't know whether I was responsible, whether we all were responsible psychically, or whether some other entity was responsible. There's no way to tell.
In hindsight, after writing about PK and studying it, what would your explanation be of why that happened?
It's probably one or more of us at the table.
Doing...
No evidence came through that was verifiable that made it look like we had a legitimate communication.
So do you think that the table moves because of some kind of intention from the unconscious intention from the people involved, or what's the mechanical force that makes the table move?
Well, I don't know if it's mechanical, but I mean, even if it's PK. I'd say what happened is similar to what happened in the famous Canadian Philip group experiments, which was a kind of PK by committee, where this group of parapsychologists in Canada invented a fictitious character named Philip, gave him a history, spent time...
From the 16th century or something like that?
17th, I believe
17th.
it was. Could be 16th. I don't recall at the moment. And they got communications ostensibly from Philip. And interestingly, those communications gave very firm answers through raps on the table when the people involved knew what the answer should be. And when the question was one that didn't have a definite answer, the raps were relatively tenuous and faint.
So it's some kind of unconscious intention from the people involved?
Yes.
But I mean, but what is raps are physical, table moving is physical. So what explains the unconscious effect on material movement?
Well, I think you have to be careful supposing there's an underlying mechanism for that. I think that's the standard maneuver in science, and unfortunately it's the standard maneuver in parapsychology. Look, most scientists assume that you can't break down phenomena in terms of underlying processes forever. You can't expect analytic explanations to go on forever. An analytic explanation is, for example, explaining heat in terms of molecular motion, in terms of some underlying process or set of processes. That's, at some point, most scientists agree, sooner or later you're going to come to some ground-level primitive phenomena, and at that point, it no longer makes sense to ask how they occur. That's just the way the universe works, and nothing deeper explains why. These are primitive, basic, fundamental phenomena. Now, I think that's fine. Otherwise, we'd have a regress of analytic explanations, and explanation would never come to an end. The problem, though, is that what most scientists assume is that wherever these primitive phenomena are, they're always at the level of the very small, the atomic, subatomic, neurological, biochemical, something like that, and never at the observable level. But that's just an article of faith. That's not an empirically established fact. And there are good philosophical reasons for thinking that in the realm of psychology, primitive phenomena are at the observable level, that there is nothing under, while there may be processes that mediate the phenomena, there's nothing deeper that analyzes it.
I interviewed Ruth Kastner, who writes about physics, and she suggested that there's space-time, and underneath that is kind of a substrata that's not bound by space or time. And that's kind of like, I guess, the primordial source. Does that fit?
I'm not sure. I don't see how it really helps us get a grip on analyzing PK or analyzing most psychological regularities. To explain what a person's immaturity is, we don't do that.
I want to get into this more, but first I want to backtrack a little bit. I'm asking, what have been your most difficult challenges and how have you coped? Because I think that's interesting to readers. So personal and professional, whatever.
My most difficult challenges? Probably getting out of 2 bad marriages. But I'm not sure I care to discuss those.
Would you say that you learned from them? Because sometimes it seems we need to go through those difficult experiences to learn.
Well, absolutely, I learned you should never marry someone who's listed in the Guinness World Records under consecutive insults.
So do you have any idea why you did marry that person or people, those two women?
Yeah, I think I do, but again, I'm not sure I want to put that on YouTube.
Okay. But Gina, you're happy with.
Yes, I'm a very lucky guy.
So maybe it's not luck, it's you learned from your previous experiences.
Well, yes, it could be.
And anything, what has it been difficult being a researcher in parapsychology in terms of your professional reputation?
Oh, yeah. Whether that's been the major struggles or challenges in my life, I don't know. But sure, I've taken a great deal of abuse. On the other hand, it's a little bit like getting a divorce. You find out things about people that you wouldn't know otherwise. So some philosophers whom I thought would be, whom I expected to be open-minded and very flexible in their thinking turned out to be surprisingly rigid and condescending. And others whom I expected to be rigid and condescending turned out to be surprisingly open-minded and welcoming. So I had a much clearer picture of my colleagues after getting into parapsychology than I did beforehand.
Has it changed? Do you think people over the decades have become more open-minded or not?
I haven't seen any large-scale change. And as I look over the history of parapsychology, the situation is pretty much what it was 150 years ago.
It seems like young people are always told, young academics, don't go into this field because it'll kill your chance of getting promoted, tenure, all that good stuff. So
don't do it before tenure, for sure.
Yeah.
And it actually retarded my promotion to full professor at one point. But I'd like to think that quality won out.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is that that something as kind of mainstream as Wikipedia makes a big point of saying it's pseudoscience. They attack you with that. Dean Radin, people who do this fantastic work. I wonder why it's so nasty and irrational.
Well, I think psi phenomena are scary. I mean, PK perhaps most of all. ESP threatens the potential privacy of our thought processes. PK is scary because, I mean, if I can move a pencil a millimeter by thought alone, it's a very small step conceptually from doing that to making somebody drop dead by thought alone. So the existence of any PK at all forces us to take seriously a kind of magical worldview that most of us associate, usually condescendingly, only with so-called primitive cultures. It's a worldview where we might have to be responsible for a range of things that most of us would just as soon be bystanders for. So if I have a nasty thought about somebody and that person has an accident, in developed countries, most people aren't comfortable with the idea that our thought might have had something to do with that accident. Granted, there are parts of the world where people take that sort of thing as a matter of course. They erect psychic defenses and so on. But it doesn't go down well in developed countries.
Right. Well, what I'm thinking of is I think there have been cases where people died because they were the victim of a voodoo curse. I mean, in the Caribbean, in Africa, there's a lot of belief in that. People don't want to leave their hair or their fingernail clippings around because someone could use it to make a spell that would harm them. So, do you know, are there actual cases where people died because of a curse? I mean, that's really PK.
Well, unless it's self-fulfilling. I mean, people could be scared shitless and just put themselves in harm's way unconsciously. I mean, we do all sorts of things to harm ourselves unconsciously. Mm-hmm. We undermine our lives in a variety of ways.
Like being way overweight or smoking or whatever.
Or getting into the bad marriages.
I don't call it bad. I call it a learning experience.
Well, you know, I've often said that the thing that most parapsychologists should be doing is studying lucky and unlucky people, especially unlucky people. I've said this many times, and people who've watched my interviews have probably heard me say this, but I'm going to say it again anyway. There's an old Yiddish distinction between a schlemiel and a schlemazel. A schlemiel is someone who spills soup on himself, and a schlemazel has it spilt on him. So the idea is that a schlemazel is an unlucky soul, somebody who's a victim of impersonal forces or the world at large, somebody the universe is crapping on. And they really exist. Not only was I married to a schlemazel, her entire family was a family of schlemazels. They were like lightning rods from misfortune. I lived next door to some schlemazels at one point. It would be really interesting, like, no way to do it now, to find out if they were schlemazels before they got married. But there's no doubt that their married life together was a living hell of calamities of one sort or another. Everything they bought was defective. Their cars were always in the shop, even though they had brands noted for their reliability. Electronic equipment would fail to work right out of the box. Their infant son was placed on a brand new solid rocking chair that broke within 2 days of ownership. And my favorite example of their schlemazelness was that the wife bought a poster-sized photo of what she thought was the Golden Gate Bridge, and she framed it and hung it on her living room wall. And she had to be told that this was the Brooklyn Bridge. So here's a woman who both literally and figuratively bought the Brooklyn Bridge.
Do you have any explanations for that? It's just that they expect bad luck, so they attract it?
Well, there are two scary possibilities. One is that somebody is doing it to them, like their weird philosopher next door neighbor, or that they're doing it to themselves in the same way that people can make themselves sick with psychosomatic ailments. Could be an expression of their own self-hatred. I mean, there are all sorts of potential deep psychodynamic explanations of why this is happening. But if you want to look for, I mean, one of the things we don't really understand about psychic functioning is what its natural history is and how it really functions on a day-to-day level. And to get a grip on that, you need to find conspicuous manifestations of it. In the case of car crashes, you can't tell whether it's caused normally or by someone's PK. But if you find somebody who's got some sort of striking regularity, psychic regularity, like a good physical medium, or people who are remarkably unlucky, then you might be able to get a grip on how psi is working in everyday life.
So people talk about synchronicity, and it usually means a positive thing. I'm thinking about you, and you the phone rings, and it's you. So this is an interesting flip side of the coin. People can have synchronicity that's negative and harmful.
Sure.
So what it really tells us is that our thought processes are magnetic in a way and attract that which we focus on. Do you agree with that?
I think that can happen. I think to some extent we influence our lives in a variety of ways. What we don't know is what the limits of that influence can be. That's why I, in fact, titled one of my books, The Limits of Influence. We don't know just how extensive or how refined our everyday psychic functioning can be. I mean, in the lab, what we get is straitjacketed psychic functioning. It's like expecting someone to be sensual under laboratory conditions. It's idiotic.
Masters and Johnson did it.
No, it's not the study of sensuality. It's not the study of what happens between people in real life.
Well, they studied sexual intercourse, let's say that.
Yes, it's quite a difference.
Yeah. So in terms of applying these concepts to doing psi research, are you saying we really don't know the process by which these psi phenomena work, so let's not do it until we do? Or are you saying we just need to acknowledge that our ignorance, or what's the practical application of this ignorance?
Well, I mean, first of all, in my opinion, laboratory research is almost absurdly premature because we don't know what kind of ability we're taking from life and trying to study in the lab. We recognize in day-to-day kinds of ways that there are certain things people do that can't be properly studied under laboratory conditions. If you want to study a tennis player's ability to return serves, you have to see how he or she plays in the actual context of a game when opponents are trying their hardest to win. And we don't know whether psychic functioning is like athletic abilities or musical abilities, which are very situation sensitive, which are constrained in a variety of ways. We don't understand what human abilities are, period. And yet we're trying to take it into the lab and study it as if we can harness it. Not only that, we can't even do properly controlled experiments in parapsychology. How do you control for a PK experiment? You can't go around with a PK meter and try to see where the lines of force are. And most laboratory researchers in parapsychology behave as if everybody involved in a psi experiment is going to adhere to a kind of idiotic gentleman's agreement, where only the official subject will use only the psychic ability being tested for, and then only when the experimenter's gun goes off, only at the appointed time, and that nobody else even remotely connected with the experiment will use whatever psychic abilities they might have to further whatever unconscious or conscious goals they might have. And there's no way to control for that. And not only that, but experimenters are probably going to be much more heavily invested in the outcome of the experiment than the subjects, no matter how interesting the experiment might be for them. And so controlling for experimenter effects is something that's almost impossible to do.
Right.
That's why I studied superstars, people who manifest psychic abilities under a variety of different conditions. And even if they're not the only ones contributing to the phenomena, at least we have a good prima facie case for saying they have some involvement in this.
Like some of the remote viewers, like McDonegal or something, that were just fantastic, consistent results in doing remote viewing.
Yes, with the great physical mediums like D.D. Hume or Eusapia Palladino or the Gold Leaf Lady or others.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the labs, the Gansfield studies where people are doing kind of ESP and the card choices, they get more than 24% that would be expected by chance. So the results are consistently above chance for remote viewing, for Gansfield, for all kinds of ESP, for precognition about the negative slide that's coming at you. So they do get results in the labs.
Yes, but they're still functionally ambiguous. We don't really have a good grip on what's going on. And they're also, it's very hard to do process-oriented studies of those kinds of phenomena. And they're also basically unconvincing. The landscape has not changed very much in terms of whether the academic community is being persuaded by these experiments. The same sorts of glib, skeptical arguments are being trotted out decade after decade after decade.
Well, that's because the skeptics don't usually read the research.
Well, that's part of it. But even when they read the research, they'll say, well, we just know this is impossible. Or they'll say really stupid things like C.E.M. Hansel used to say, if someone wants to demonstrate that they have telepathic abilities, they just have to tell me what I'm thinking. That's an idiotic thing to say. If I said to Hansel, let's see a penile erection, and he couldn't perform, I'm sure he'd resist the conclusion that he's just unable to get it up.
Right. So is it fair to say that lab research does get statistically significant results, but we don't know why? We don't know exactly what we're measuring.
I'm more comfortable with that, yes.
Okay. What about your personal experiences of synchronicity? And you also write that there's a lot of confusion about Jung's concept of synchronicity, which is where we kind of got the idea from. So what's your take on that?
Well, Jung was confused about what causality was. He seemed to think that the only kind of causal connections were billiard ball causal connections, where a cause is immediately prior in space and time to its effect. So he thought ESP would be acausal. That's just confused. Secondly, he thought that synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, were somehow built into nature, that nature brought events together in terms of their intrinsic meaningful relations. But events are not intrinsically meaningful or meaningless. Meaning is something that's relative to a particular agent, a particular mind, a set of intentions, and a context. So unless you're going to bring in God as the originator of the cosmic perspective in virtue of which things are meaningful, Jung didn't really know what he was talking about. So that's why I say that the most plausible analysis of synchronicities, if there are really non-random coincidences, that we're bringing them about ourselves.
Yeah, it's not some intelligence in nature, it's our chemistry, so to speak.
Yes.
There's, as a philosopher, I'm going to ask you to define consciousness. People don't like it when I ask them that, but it needs.
I also don't like it.
But I'm asking you.
It's a fuzzy, inelastic term. I would be reluctant to give it a definition.
But this whole phenomena of a new paradigm, which is really very old in terms of idealism, it's a new paradigm of consciousness underlying material manifestation. So we've got to define consciousness because it's a pivotal concept in defining the new paradigm.
Doesn't have to be. It could all be done more clearly than it's been done now.
Okay.
We don't even know what materialism means, for God's sake. I mean, what used to count as materialism, what counts as material now?
You mean like atoms and electrons and photons aren't really material?
Well, no, they are material, but I mean, there was a time when material meant just solid bodies. And then things got smaller and smaller and smaller. And now we're talking about units of matter that have very mysterious properties.
That only exist in probability. That's not exactly matter if you're only probable.
Well, but people who refer to that and try to analyze, say, psychological properties in terms of material properties will refer to such things. And that's what they mean by materialism. So I'm not going to try to define materialism or consciousness. Sorry to be difficult.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that if you had a dog, it's conscious?
Yeah, I do.
What about an amoeba?
Don't know.
Because what I'm not clear is if consciousness is defined as awareness or being able to think, analyze, how far down does it go?
It's a good question. It's one to which I don't have an answer. And it's one which I don't think has to have a final answer either. I mean, I know there's a tendency in both philosophy and various branches of science to suppose there's got to be some final preferred definition of these terms. But I think language isn't like that. Language is not a calculus. Meanings are not rigid entities. And I think, you know, one of the things I learned when writing and studying multiple personalities is that the concept of a person, the concept of identity, is very elastic also. And when we ask how many distinct individuals are there in a multiple personality, there are different answers to that question under different circumstances. We might say there's more than one person if we're concerned only about the propriety of giving different gifts to different personalities at Christmas time. I mean, or treating the child personality differently from the adult personality. But if you're asking about how many driver's licenses or social security numbers or chances to vote the person gets, there's one person.
Right.
And no one of those senses of the term person has to be preferred over the other. They're all context dependent. I would say the same about consciousness.
Is it true with multiple personalities that one alter can have diabetes, the other doesn't? One alter could wear glasses, the other doesn't?
Yes.
Do you have a concrete example of that, of different medical issues for different alters?
Eye color changes, allergies change. If the famous case of, I think it was Doris Fisher. I can't remember if it's Doris Fisher or another one. But one personality was addicted to drugs and another one was not.
To
Now,
me, that's
we know
really
that good
profound.
hypnotic... I'm sorry?
That's really profound that the same body can have totally different physiological state according to what personality is up.
Well, it's very cool because we've known from the history of hypnosis for a long time that people can do remarkable things to their bodies. We also know that through psychosomatic ailments and miracle healings and so on.
And placebo.
But people who are good hypnotic subjects can raise welts on the skin, alter personalities who've been abused, say, with cigarette burns. If you switch to that personality, the burns will appear on the skin.
So what are the philosophical implications of a body being so influenced by, let's say, a mental emotional process? How does that work?
Well, I think it's PK. It's just PK on one's body. I mean, the fact is we can do all sorts of remarkable things. There were some biofeedback experiments in the 1970s by a guy named Basmajian. And he found that people could be trained through biofeedback to fire a single muscle cell, but none of the surrounding cells.
Wow.
And of course, he had no idea, the subjects had no idea how they did that.
Right. So did you work with people with dissociative identity disorder one-on-one, or how did you study them?
Well, I got to know a bunch. I got to know the clinicians treating them, and even had a multiple living in the house for a while.
And why were you studying them? What did you want to understand?
Well, it was after I'd written a couple books on parapsychology. I knew at some point I wanted to write a book on the evidence for survival of death. But I also knew that people suffering from dissociative identity disorder looked a lot like mediums, channeling different entities.
Ah, I never thought of that.
And so I figured I couldn't do a responsible job on the evidence for life after death unless I had a really firm grip on the history of hypnosis and the history of psychiatry and dissociative identity disorder in particular. And one of the things I discovered as I got into the literature on survival was that most of the people writing about survival were inexcusably superficial about these crucial matters.
Matters like what?
Like what the differences or the similarities are between multiplicity and mediumship.
So what's the connection between multiple alters and survival after death?
Well, they look a lot alike.
How so?
Well, when a multiple switches personalities, it looks like a medium channeling a different entity. There was a very interesting film that psychiatrist David Spiegel from Stanford made a number of years ago. A TV anchor woman in San Francisco said to him, we have all these channels out here on the West Coast. Some of them have to be legitimate. And Spiegel said, show me anybody who's a good hypnotic subject and I'll turn him into a channel. So she volunteered her cameraman. And Spiegel made this movie where he hypnotized the cameraman, and all of a sudden the cameraman's affect changed totally, and he started ostensibly channeling this intergalactic being. And he said things like, greetings, friends, my name is Zantac, or whatever, And then he started spouting all these platitudes, New Age platitudes. Now, it doesn't show that that's how we can dismiss all cases of ostensible channeling, but it shows why it's not just an academic exercise.
Got it. So did you conclude that personalities do transcend death?
I'm inclined toward that, but it took me almost 400 pages to get to that point. And I still think most of the people writing about survival today don't know what the issues are. They don't know how to evaluate the evidence. They completely ignore things that matter a lot, like the study of savants and prodigies, gifted underachievers, and multiplicity.
And does reincarnation connect into those savants and child prodigies and children who remember their past lives? Does that fit into all this?
Sure, because people make claims, for example, that if an ostensibly reincarnated child exhibits abilities that were associated with the deceased and which the child had no opportunity to learn, that somehow is miraculous. And it seems a whole lot less miraculous when you study savants and prodigies.
So what's another explanation for why they have those unique abilities, savants and prodigies?
Well, what you need to do is look deeply into the lives of the other people involved, like the parents of the reincarnated child or the parents of the relatives of the deceased. And usually the people doing the research treat all these peripheral actors as psychological stick figures. I think it's one of the great shames of Ian Stevenson's work, which in many other respects is extremely valuable, that Stevenson is very superficial about the underlying dynamics of the cases.
But there's really specific findings. He reported something like 20% or something of the kids had birthmarks that reflected their mode of death in the previous life. So, I mean, that's really concrete.
Well, sure, it's an interesting data, but the reincarnation hypothesis doesn't explain that particularly well either. I mean, how's that supposed to happen?
Well, because, okay, I was hanged in my past life, so I have some kind of scar on my neck. There's some kind of imprint that's more than cellular from my previous existence, right?
But how's that supposed to be transmitted? The body is long ago dissolved.
Right. So it means that there's more transmitted than is physical.
Well, it could be done through PK from the family of the deceased.
But they don't know about the new baby.
How do you know?
Because if they're in India in one village and the kid's born in another village, the probability of them knowing about the birth of a baby is very small.
Well, the probability of the case happening is very small.
No, they're like 20%, something like that. Of the kids had those kind of specific birthmarks that reflected their previous death in Stevenson's work.
Look, don't get me wrong. I'm actually sympathetic to the survival hypothesis, but I just think the case has not been made persuasively. And until you've really examined what needs either the the child currently appearing to be reincarnated, what the needs of that child's parents are, what the needs of the deceased family members are, you really can't get a grip on these things. And the reason I think it's important to know that is because in the few cases where we've actually got some depth psychological information about the participants in these cases, they look less and less miraculous.
Do you have a specific example in mind?
Yes, I write about them in my book, Immortal Remains.
They're
not easy to explain quickly, because to go into the deep dynamics, you need to get into the grubby details.
Okay. This is kind of an end note. With the people with dissociative identity disorder, are they able to coalesce their alters, or is it very difficult? Or are they, if Susie is up, is she aware of Joey? Or do you have a really focus, you forget about all the other alters when you're up?
There are varieties of different cases. I mean, in some cases of DID, the various alters know about one another and even have council meetings under the surface.
Oh, wow.
Controlling, for functional multiples, that might be the way they determine that the children get a chance to be in charge of the body and play, and that they come out only at appropriate times, like in the privacy of their room or in a toy store where childlike behavior might look eccentric, but at least understandable. As far as integration is concerned, I've talked about this in depth with some multiples, and their experience as integrated is that the different centers of consciousness do, in a sense, coalesce, and this leads to the adult multiples' first experience of having indecisions. So, for example, when the multiple is quite divided and going to a grocery store, it might be that the children pick out the cereal or the toys, and the practical persons pick out household cleaners, and a different one who's good with numbers takes care of the register and so on. But the integrated multiple might wonder, going down the aisle, well, should I get this or this? The kind of thing, the kind of experience that he or she might not have had for many, many years.
How interesting. Another end note, I think we all have subpersonalities. So the
Sure.
only thing about DID people is just more extreme. But we all have a child, an adult, or whatever.
Well, it's not just that it's a difference in degree, it's a difference in kind, because the alters, in cases of multiple personality, have different centers of awareness. So, I have a musical personality and a philosophical personality, but I can describe either one in the first person. But in the case of multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder, the various alters do not speak of other alters in the first person. They speak of them as he, she, or whatever. And they experience things that way.
So how does this fit in with your interest in philosophy of mind, and how does it fit in with memory? If this brain has to have so many different memories, I think you say that memory isn't stored in the brain, which is what Ibn Alexander said, because he remembered after his brain was pus.
Yeah, it's a complicated argument. I can't give it in a few sentences. I think the whole storage analogy is mistaken. There was, I'll just leave it at that, but encourage people to read Crimes of Reason, if I can put in a sleazy plug.
Oh, no, it's not sleazy, it's useful. So people talk about the brain as this little fatty, watery thing that is here, but then there's mind. And so is it possible that memory is part of mind with a capital M, which is much broader and maybe lasts after death?
I don't know that we have grounds for taking mind to be a thing any more than the weather or the economy are things. When we talk about the weather, you can say the weather changes, or the weather is good today, or whatever, but we don't suppose that the weather is a substance, even if it's an immaterial substance. Same about the economy. The weather and the economy are general terms for either meteorological processes or economic transactions, financial transactions. Similarly, the mind doesn't have to be a thing. It could be a general term for the class of psychological interactions.
And it could exist outside of the brain.
Well, first of all, I would say let's be careful about calling it an it. Okay? I mean, in the same way that we'd be a little reluctant to speak of the economy as an it. The economy might not, or probably could not exist unless there were physical financial transactions. The weather would not exist unless there were physical climatic transactions. And for all we know at this point, I know it's very fashionable to say that the mind can exist outside the body, and the survival evidence suggests that may be true in a way. But I just urge caution in the way we talk about this, and caution about supposing that the mind has to be a kind of thing or a kind of substance.
Well, so after doing all this research, what's your personal hunch as to what happens to you when you die?
Well, I hope I persist in some way, and I hope I can get my hair back.
Why don't you PK it back?
I used to know the famous healer Olga Worrell, and I was once at her house, and I was playing something on the piano for the company in her living room, and there came a crashing sound from the piano bench, and also a sound as if one of the low strings on the piano had been struck, but there was nothing there that would have caused that. And I said to Olga, just jokingly, is anyone sitting next to me on the piano bench? And she said, no, dearie, but your grandfather's behind you, your mother's father. And I said, well, can you describe him? She said, well, he's broad. I said, okay. She said, and he has a beard. I said, well, he never used to have a beard. He said, well, and she said, well, he does now. He can have a beard if he wants. So I'm hopeful.
Was your grandfather broad?
Yes, actually.
Uh-huh. Okay. You've also delved into philosophy of time. Speaking of time, we'll get to the end of this. Where did you go with that?
Oh, it was a bunch of issues in temporal logic and analyzing tenses in language, and some issues about the philosophy of language that turned out to lead me to some controversial arguments that maybe only a philosopher would love.
Mm.
Very technical.
Mm. What kind of surprised me when I read the summary of the Galileo report that they did in Europe is they said the main problem with psi research is a lack of replicated studies. And I said, well, there have been thousands of them, and more than thousands. And they said, but they're not the same. And you wrote an article that said we don't hold that kind of standard to most sciences because there's always going to be differences with different subjects, different experimenters. So the issue of being replicable, and by the way, I forwarded your article to the authors, isn't really valid.
Well, I know Harold Volokh liked my editorial on replicability.
Oh, that's what I sent to him.
Yeah, sure. Not all sciences make a big deal out of replicability. It's useful and more or less appropriate in some physical sciences, but there are some other sciences of perfectly sound scientific credentials like geology and meteorology and astronomy and cosmology where replication plays a very small role. And there are other problems as well with the concept of replicability, but I think too much is made of that. And besides, as you note, parapsychology has a pretty good replication scorecard. Probably at least as good as orthodox psychology.
Probably better because they're so careful.
Right.
So you say that psi the research should focus on spontaneous or semi-experimental cases. What do you mean?
Well, I'm glad there are people like Dean Radin and others who are willing to do very creative laboratory work, and Dean's work is extremely interesting. But I've always preferred to focus on people around whom large-scale things are happening so we can have some prima facie idea who the real subject of the phenomena would be. So I've studied PK superstars, people like historical figures like D.D. Hume, Eusapia Palladino, or people like the Gold Leaf Lady, or this subject in Argentina I studied recently, Ariel Farias. I think there we might get a handle, first of all, on such questions as what are the limits of psychic functioning? How extreme can the phenomena be? I mean, we don't have a real standard of measurement for impressiveness, psychic impressiveness. And I agree with Charles Richet, who said many years ago, it's as interesting and impressive to see the materialization of a single finger as it would be to see the materialization of a full human figure. We don't understand either one. They're both pretty great.
The Argentinian that you studied, what could he do?
Well, he's started out in life as a poltergeist agent in his early teens. And even today, when he gets agitated, things fly off shelves. But he found that by placing his hands very lightly on a tabletop, the table would rise underneath his hands. And it's been studied very carefully.
So what's the point of making the table rise?
Well, there are people who don't think macro PK is possible. And so I think it's actually the easiest kind of psychic phenomenon to document. So I'm always looking for good documentation.
Yeah. What did the gold leaf? She made this woman in Florida made gold leaf appear on her skin.
It was a golden colored foil that actually turned out to be made of brass that would appear instantly and spontaneously all over her body. I've seen it several times. A lot
Face
of
to
people have
face.
seen it.
You saw it person to person.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And where might the brass come from? How would she manifest? I mean, we don't have brass in our bodies.
Well, certainly not in the quantity that she exuded. So it looks like, although it looks like she's sweating copper and zinc, which is what brass is, she'd have to have lethal amounts of those substances in her to have as much that actually appears on her. So it looks like it's a materialization phenomenon or an apport, getting the brass leaf from some other site and putting it on her body.
Did she? How did it happen spontaneously and was a big surprise to her, or what was the origin of this phenomena?
She was having some poltergeist like happenings in connection with her marriage at the time. It was, as far as I can tell, a difficult marriage. And so things were appearing and disappearing, rearranging themselves. And one day a carving set appeared. And her husband said to her, "What good is it if it isn't money?" And then 2 days later, her body started to break out in what looked like gold leaf. So if you want my half-assed pop psychological analysis of this, it would be that symbolically it satisfies her husband's demand for something valuable, but she doesn't really have to be the goose that laid the golden egg. And because that's a pretty heavy responsibility. And also it allows her a safe way of expressing her rage against her husband. I think she felt trapped in the marriage, and her husband wanted something valuable, and she was giving him fool's gold. She was giving him the psychic finger.
Right.
So I think that's what we know about the case, I believe, is it's psychogenesis. What we don't know about the case is what was really happening.
Did it continue, or was just like a temporary phenomena?
Went on for many years, and as far as I know, it still is.
The mediums that you've mentioned, other people say, oh, they're fakes and they're doing sleight of hand, and they're why are you convinced that they're genuine?
Well, as you say, the people who make those claims probably never even read the original reports. Some of the cases are just too damned impressive, and it's really the responsibility of the skeptic to explain how, under the particular conditions in which the phenomenon occurred, the phenomenon could have been faked. It's time for them to put up or shut up.
When I'm dying to talk to skeptics, so I talked to Susan Blackmore in England, and she said that she dismissed even Alexander's near-death experience because it could have happened when the brain was functioning before it went into coma or a little bit after, so it's nothing special. It's just, I guess, some like hallucination of a functioning brain.
Well, time stamping an NDE is very difficult. I mean, we don't really know when it occurred. Especially if precognition or retrocognition are possible. But in the case of physical phenomena, like D.D. Hume making an accordion play on request, untouched, that's another matter.
I've bent spoons. Have you done that kind of stuff?
I haven't bent a spoon, but I've made a table rise.
Oh, good. That's fun.
Yeah, I was happy about that.
Did you intend for it to rise?
Well, I told you about that incident back in Massachusetts.
In grad school, right. Yeah. So you're a referee in a series of journals, and in the book I'm going to include a list of psi journals, and I wondered maybe now or later you could just email me what you think are the journals that we would recommend to readers that do the good research, serious research.
Well, I can tell you right now.
Great.
I'm editor-in-chief of the Journal of Scientific Exploration, which deals with anomalies of all kinds, not just parapsychological, but could deal with matters of unidentified flying objects, cryptozoology, cold fusion.
Larry Dossey's involved with that, right?
As a referee, but he's a member of the Society for Scientific Exploration. So the nice thing about the SSE and the JSE is that they deal with a whole range of phenomena that are treated, either ignored or treated very shabbily by mainstream science. But for more purely parapsychological journals, there's the Journal of Parapsychology, there's the Journal of the SPR in England, the Australian Journal of Parapsychology.
You also have Parapsychological Review, European Journal of Parapsychology.
The European Journal no longer exists.
Ah, okay.
The Paranormal Review is the magazine of the SPR. The SSE has a magazine also called Edge Science.
Edge Science. Okay. And in terms of the top-notch, like, conference putter honors, would you say the Society for Scientific Exploration? Someone who went to the one in Colorado in June said it wasn't that interesting. Did you go?
Well, I'm more or less obligated to go. I edit their journal.
Right. What did you think? I know that the effort was to define this new paradigm and flesh it out. Did that happen?
The theme was consilience, which isn't altogether clear. I'm not sure how successfully they dealt with the theme, but there were a lot of interesting papers. So if someone didn't find it interesting, well, that's unfortunate, but a lot of others did. I thought it was a successful conference.
And did you see that there was a fleshing out of the new paradigm, which is really the old paradigm?
Well, I saw various people trying to do that. I'm usually not very impressed by people's efforts to try that sort of thing. Theorizing is about as easy as lying.
That's interesting. So, what's your next book? What are you researching now?
I'm not sure if there's a next book. I may be pretty booked out.
Did you have 6 books?
6 books, 3 of which which came out in revised and expanded edition. Yes.
And over 60 articles. So that leads to my question of what do you do for fun?
Well, I'm also a musician. I do 3D photography. And I have a fabulous wife.
That's great. Have you had kids along the way?
No.
Then my last question is, the world situation seems to be getting worse with climate change, the rise of autocrats, growing inequality. Are you hopeful or pessimistic about our future?
I reject the premise of your question. I don't think the world is getting worse. There have always been tyrants.
But what about climate change? We've never been this bad.
I reject that too. Actually, I think there are lots of scientists who think that climate change, human-caused climate change, is not all that clear. And they're ignored the same way parapsychologists are ignored. The whole issue is very politicized. So I'd say we should be very careful about conclusions we reach.
But the climate's warming, there's more extreme weather events, tornadoes, floods, scarcity of water because of drought. How can one deny that?
The question is whether it would have happened anyway.
But it's I think, what's his name, the vice president who did the...
Al Gore.
Al Gore shows that the history is like, and then now it's like, boop, so the graph is way off. So it's a historical event.
There's no doubt that humans are contributing to the climate, but whether it's really something to worry about, I think it depends on the model we use. And the models have, as far as at least some people are concerned, have not been all that successful. So I don't pretend to be an expert on this. I just think it's important to be suspicious about what scientists are saying in an area that's as politicized as this particular one. And anybody who's been involved in parapsychology should be suspicious for exactly the same reason.
Is there anything else that you would like readers, listeners to think about in terms of the new understanding of consciousness, the word you don't like, or anything else that we've talked about or not talked about that we should have?
I'm sure I'll think of something as soon as we stop.
Okay. All right. Thank you.